Inside a brick fortress in western Massachusetts, wooden racks rise floor to ceiling, holding roughly 645 different rifles, standing in perfect rows with no soldiers left to carry them. George Washington chose this hill himself in 1777, not for glory, but because British warships could not reach it. For 174 years, this one building armed the American soldier. Then, in 1968, a single Pentagon memo ended it. Not a war, not an enemy, a signature. The rifles are still there. The reason they stopped mattering is not. Washington needed a place British cannons could never touch. Coastal arsenals could be shelled from the water. This hill, above the meeting point of the Connecticut and Mill Rivers, could not. That single tactical fact is why Springfield Armory exists at all. Congress made it official in 1794, and the site's founding logic was simple. Build inland, build permanent, build where the enemy's navy cannot follow. The first threat came from Americans. In January 1787, farmers crushed by post-war debt, led by a Massachusetts man named Daniel Shays, marched on the Armory itself, aiming to seize its weapons stores. Militia artillery answered from the walls, and the rebellion broke apart under fire, its dead becoming an early lesson. Whoever controlled Springfield controlled the country's ability to arm itself. Within a decade of its founding, the Armory had already proven it was worth attacking. That vulnerability became the point. A federal government that wanted total control over rifle production got exactly that. One site, one authority, no competitors. It solved a problem. It also meant the Armory's survival would never depend on customers, markets, or demand. It would depend entirely on political will, renewed year after year, decision after decision. Inside, that control produced something nobody expected. In the 1820s, a machinist named Thomas Blanchard built a lathe that could carve the irregular curve of a wooden gunstock automatically, without a craftsman's hand guiding every cut. It was built to solve one narrow problem, making rifle stocks faster. Instead, it helped invent an entire manufacturing philosophy, interchangeable parts, precision tooling, the assembly logic that would later build sewing machines, bicycles, and automobiles. Springfield Armory did not just make guns. It quietly built the machine that built modern industrial America. The building grew heavier with purpose. Water from the Mill River turned trip hammers and grinding wheels before steam power existed. Rail spurs later connected the site to the rest of the country, moving raw iron in and finished rifles out. What began as a defensible hilltop storehouse was becoming something the young nation had never built before, a permanent, centralized, federally owned factory whose sole purpose was arming every American soldier who would ever need a rifle. By the time the Civil War came, that purpose had already outgrown the hill it stood on. The armory that Washington picked for its safety from the sea was about to become something far bigger, far louder, and far more essential than anyone standing on that riverbank in 1777 could have imagined. The rifles on the racks today are proof it worked. What happened after it worked is the part nobody explains at the gift shop. By the Civil War, Springfield Armory was no longer a hilltop storehouse. It was a factory running on national fear, and the numbers proved it. Workers poured through its gates by the thousands, machine shops running long shifts to keep pace with a war that needed rifles faster than any single site had ever produced them. The Model 1861 rifled musket left this hill by the hundreds of thousands, and for long stretches of the 19th century, Springfield was the only place in the country making the standard-issue weapon every Union soldier carried. One hillside, one building, arming a war. The machine did not slow down when the guns changed. The trapdoor Springfield followed in the 1870s and 1880s, then the bolt-action M1903, each one designed, tested, and produced inside the same fortress brick walls George Washington's safety calculation had chosen a century earlier. Springfield was not simply manufacturing weapons. It was the design office for the American infantry rifle, generation after generation, and the town outside its walls had built its entire identity around that fact. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow visited the arsenal and reportedly stood before the vertical rifle racks, struck by the sight of thousands of weapons lined up like pipes in a church organ. He wrote The Arsenal at Springfield afterward, comparing the racked muskets to an instrument of terrible music. A poem born inside a government weapons warehouse. Even before it became a museum, the Armory had already become something people needed to make sense of through art, not just inventory sheets. Then came John C. Garand, a quiet, methodical engineer on the Armory's own payroll, who spent years designing a semi-automatic rifle the Army adopted in 1936. The M1 Garand became the rifle of the Second World War, the weapon General George S. Patton is widely quoted as calling the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was not built by a private contractor chasing a bid. It was built by a government employee inside a government building, on a hill George Washington had picked for reasons that had nothing to do with rifles at all. Wartime demand pushed the workforce toward a scale the Armory had never seen, reportedly climbing past 13,000 workers during the Second World War's peak. That number is not a statistic. It is shift changes swallowing the town before sunrise, parking lots overflowing, payday traffic clogging the streets outside the gate, families who scheduled their entire lives around whistle blasts they never had to explain to outsiders. Springfield, the city, and Springfield, the Armory had become, for all practical purposes, the same organism. The dependents went both directions. The Armory needed steel, rail access, water power, and skilled hands. The town needed the Armory's paycheck, and generations of families built their identities around jobs passed from father to son inside the same machine shops. Local diners, shops, and neighborhoods existed because the gate opened every morning. Nobody in Springfield in the 1940s was asking what would happen if it ever closed. 2 world wars, a civil war, and a rebellion had already tried to end this place. It had survived all of them. That survival record was the dangerous part. It made permanence feel like a fact instead of a policy. The rifles kept coming. The racks kept filling. Nobody in that crowd walking through the gate at dawn was thinking about a budget office in Washington that had never once fired a rifle from this Armory and had no intention of ever needing to. The rifle that survived the Second World War could not survive a spreadsheet. In the 1960s, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara pushed a Pentagon-wide consolidation of military manufacturing, aimed at cutting costs across a defense budget strained by an ongoing war in Vietnam. Private contractors could now build the same rifles Springfield had designed, cheaper, without the overhead of a government-run facility that had operated continuously since 1794. In 1968, the order came down. Springfield Armory would close, not because its rifles failed, not because an enemy reached it, because an accountant's math finally caught up to a hillside Washington had chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with cost. The war it was closed during was still going on. That is the detail that should stop you. Springfield outlasted the War of 1812, the Civil War, 2 world wars, and Korea. It did not outlast a peacetime consolidation memo signed in the middle of Vietnam. The base that survived every war America fought was ended by the one force it had no defense against, a federal decision made in a building it never saw, by a man it never met. The machine shops went quiet first, then the workforce that had once numbered in the thousands scattered, taking with them the shift change routines, the payday traffic, the identity Springfield had built around one employer for 174 years. The town had to explain the silence to itself. There was no single villain to blame, no scandal, no failure, just a budget line that no longer justified keeping a single-mission government factory running when a private company could do the same job for less. For 6 years, the buildings sat in limbo, their future undecided, their machine floors empty, their rifle racks unattended. Then, in 1974, the National Park Service designated the main arsenal building and its grounds a National Historic Site, preserving the rifle collection rather than letting it be dispersed or sold for parts. Another section of the same campus became Springfield Technical Community College, so that within a few years of closure, students were walking hallways where workers had once assembled the weapon that armed a war. Nothing was demolished. Nothing was scrapped. The fortress brick walls that Washington's tactical logic had demanded in 1777 turned out to be worth keeping for an entirely different reason: history. The gates that once controlled a restricted federal manufacturing site now opened freely to the public. The silence that once would have signaled a security breach now just means it is a Tuesday afternoon at a museum. The rifle racks are still there, the same ones Longfellow reportedly stood before more than a century before the closure, the same ones photographed and preserved rather than emptied into a scrapyard. Around 645 rifle types remain, arranged floor to ceiling, in a building that once represented total federal control over how America armed itself. Visitors walk past them now without necessarily knowing that this hill was chosen because ships could not reach it, that farmers once tried to storm it, that a government machinist quietly designed the rifle patent praised, or that the entire operation ended with a signature rather than a surrender. The racks still stand at attention. No soldier is coming to collect them. That was never going to change again.